I'm Tal Beery, and it's my pleasure this evening to welcome you to this virtual presentation. As some of you may know, I'm the artist behind the installation currently on display at the Jewish Museum of Maryland, called In the Absence of a Proper Mourning, which inspired Faiths in Mourning, our program for this evening. Thank you all for being here, and thank you to the dedicated and talented staff at the Jewish Museum of Maryland, especially Saul Davis, Joanna Church, Paige Woodhouse, Trillian Atwood, and Laura Grant, who've been a pleasure to work with despite the gravity of the subject matter of this project. And I'd also like to thank Ronit Mushtablit from LABA, who has been behind this project every step of the way. If you'd like to learn more about In the Absence of a Proper Mourning, information is available on JMM's website. I'm also extremely grateful to our speakers this evening, who are kind, wise teachers and leaders who've cared dutifully and faithfully and generously for their communities throughout this pandemic. And I very much look forward to hearing what you have to say. Before we start the program this evening, we want to share a little of the installation with you. You're about to see a short video featuring clips of just 3 of the stories from members of the Baltimore community that were collected as part of this project.
I mean, we were sitting Shiva for my uncle when my aunt died, and we had to switch gears and call the rabbi. Now you need to do another funeral, and it was, that part was just, that was the least peaceful of all of it, quite honestly. It was that he was dying, she was getting better, then he was getting better, then she was possibly getting better, then she wasn't doing well, and it was back and forth, and the amount of calls and texts and communication from the hospital, which was wonderful, and we were thankful for it, but it was a constant, who are we focusing most our energy on right now? And like I had said, there's some peace to knowing that neither one had to live without the other for 5 days. There's something to that, and knowing that their quality of life would not have been what they would have wanted had they recovered from this.
She said to us that you were just there in the room, is what we just want you there. And I have to say, I'd have to answer that I would have done anything to be there for her in that room. And we were in the room, but so different experience. And I hadn't gone to a funeral in person since COVID, anything like that. But we were there, we were in the room, and we were present. But the lack of intimacy, the lack of closeness, the lack of hugs and whispers and laughs and chats, and it was very difficult. The idea of the Zooms, or they let you know that the family was not going to speak, and the family just sat quietly, but there was a clergy member who facilitated it, and people spoke from what they wanted to speak, one at a time. Very organized. Everything was so organized. But maybe that was also hard because there was no spontaneity.
I think the hard part was when we came home. So we traveled to New Jersey, Pennsylvania, for the funerals. And when we came home, there was nothing. So none of our friends, there's just kind of nothing. And we do have some very good friends in Baltimore that said, it's nice out, we'll meet you in the courtyard, we'll bring food. So some of those traditional things where people are around and they bring you food and you don't have to worry about things, our friends did for us, but all outside. So it was really hard because my friends were like, put your mask on, I'll hug you from the side. We weren't able, we felt the support and we were thankful for the support, but it felt so remote and removed that it was definitely different. And so I really feel for all the people that had to go through this during COVID, because the traditions, whatever they are just hard to navigate through social distancing, mask wearing, people being afraid to come out in person. So, we had several people that stopped by and we sat in the courtyard or they took a walk with us. Just kind of new traditions, I guess. New way to support people.
I encourage you to use the link in the chat, or you can hear those and other interviews more fully. So now to welcome our moderator for this evening. Chloe Zelka is the co-founder of the COVID Grief Network, a mutual aid organization offering free group and one-on-one grief support to folks in their 20s and 30s who are grieving the loss of someone to COVID-19. Previously, she worked as a community organizer at secular and faith-based justice organizations and as a hospital chaplain at UCSF Medical Center. She's currently studying towards rabbinic ordination at Hebrew Union College, where she's a Wexner Graduate Fellow. Chloe, I hand it off to you.
Thanks so much. Thanks, everyone. And hi out there. We're really lucky to be here today with such powerful faith leaders, and I can't wait to learn from them. I want to open our conversation by introducing you to them, to our panelists. So first, Rabbi Eitan Mintz is here with us. He studied for 2 years at Yeshivat Sha'alvim in Israel and received rabbinic ordination from Yeshiva University's Rabbi Isaac Elchanan Theological Seminary. He also holds a master's degree in Jewish philosophy and mysticism from the Bernard Revel Graduate School and an MPA from the Kennedy School at Harvard University. He received his pastoral counseling training through a year-long chaplain residency program at the University of Virginia Health System, where he counseled individuals of all faiths in times of crisis. Rav Eitan served for 5 years as associate rabbi at the Hebrew Institute of Riverdale. He also taught Jewish thought, text, and practice at the Charles E. Smith Jewish Day School in Rockville, Maryland, and today he leads B'nai Israel Synagogue located in downtown Baltimore. Rav Eitan is married to Dr. Tammy Mintz, a clinical and school psychologist, and they are proud parents of Ilana, Shlomo, Noam, and Abby. Welcome, Rabbi Mintz.
Thank you, Chloe.
And also welcoming Dr. Terrace King, who is a visionary committed to transforming healthcare companies through his company, the King Enterprise Group, an initiative focused on consulting the fastest growing small businesses in the Department of Health and Human Services, healthcare IT, with revenue exceeding 100 million. He previously served the federal government in progressively expanding roles, including the Deputy Chief Information Officer at the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services and the Director of the Office of Minority Health. For 6 years, Dr. King served as Deputy Director of the Office of Clinical Standards and Quality. And in this role, he was the CMS Executive Lead for Value-Based Purchasing for the new payment model innovation. Also the lead executive responsible for reducing health disparities. Terrace completed both his scientific doctorate in occupational science and his undergraduate degree in mass communications from Towson University. He also completed his master's in behavioral science from Johns Hopkins University and completed a Harvard University Executive Fellowship. Welcome, Dr. King. And finally, want to welcome Imam Yassin Sheikh, who was born in 1982 to parents of Indian origin in Hackney, London, where he lived for much of his life. He obtained all of his religious school education, including memorization of the entire Quranic text, Alimiyyah studies, a rigorous Islamic theology program, and also certification in issuing fatwa, religious verdicts, from traditional seminaries in London. Imam Yassin has served as an imam since 2002 in Stoke Newington, London, where he was also head of Islamic studies at a private school, Tawheed Secondary School. And in 2006, Imam Yassin moved to the US to serve at a mosque in Dallas, Texas. Later, he joined the Muslim community in Baltimore, Maryland as resident scholar. And in 2016, Imam Yassin had the pleasure of hosting then President Barack Obama at his Islamic Center in what was his only visit to a mosque during his presidency. In 2018, Imam Yassin returned to the UK to be closer to family and served as an imam and bereavement counselor at the largest and only dedicated Muslim cemetery in the UK, Gardens of Peace. Here he performed the end-of-life rituals, offered bereavement counseling and support, and provided training on Muslim end-of-life matters to a variety of institutions. Imam Yassin has recently moved back to the Baltimore area with his wife and 3 daughters. He's an avid soccer fan and enjoys time with family and friends. Welcome, Imam Yassin. So thanks all for being here. And we're going to open today by asking each of our panelists to talk briefly about the mourning practices within their own religious tradition and the traditions and customs that were practiced in the pre-COVID era. So I'll pass it off first to Rabbi Eitan Mintz.
Thank you so much, Chloe. Thank you, Trillian, for organizing this program. And thank you. It's an honor to be here with you with the other wonderful panelists, Dr. King and Imam Yassin. Good to see everybody tonight and good to be with you all. What an important topic, what a vital topic that we're discussing tonight. The mourning practices in the Jewish faith are ones that I have found to give tremendous solace and comfort to those in a time of grief and time of mourning. And in fact, I know it's on one foot, but I want to share a few elements of those practices. One thing that's interesting is that they're very much guided by Jewish law. They're very much prescripted, and it gives very much a lot of guidance to people, even people who wouldn't necessarily turn to Jewish law in general. I find that during times of mourning, people are looking for guidance from the tradition and very much looking to do traditional Jewish mourning practices. It starts actually even prior to the mourning period. There's a period, an intermediate period, which is when people are called an onain. It's the period before the burial when people are not officially yet in the time of Shiva and the time of mourning, but it's the period when one is supposed to be solely and completely focused on the details of burying the departed, and to try to bury as soon as possible is a very important piece of the Jewish tradition. There's a concept of kavod hamet, giving honor to the departed, even though their soul is no longer with the departed. Their body, being a vessel of holiness, should be taken care of and given honor and respect. And one of the ways that's done is by burying back to the earth, just as we came from earth and dust, and so too we return to such, but to do it in as quick as possible. In fact, in Jerusalem, the tradition is actually to do it right away, even if it's in the middle of the night, to go out and to bury it in the evening and as soon as possible. And even here in the States, you'll find that people will try to bury next day if possible. And during that period, people the mourners are not quite in mourning. They're, like I said, they're focused on their duties, the last kindness that they can do to their loved one, which is the actual burial. And in fact, the burial itself is called the levaya tamet, a levaya, a funeral, which means that we're accompanying the departed from this world to the next world. The mourning practices, again, just a piece and a highlight, are called Shiva. When we sit Shiva, literally to the 7-day period, when we stay in our homes and the home, particularly if possible, the home of the departed, to sit and to mourn. But the mourning period is a time of focusing and celebrating the life of the departed, being able to tell stories about the departed, sharing pictures of the departed, spending time in prayer. All of the prayers turn to the home, as opposed to going into the synagogue. The synagogue comes to the family and comes to their home, and the community comes into the home of the departed where the mourners are sitting Shiva. And after that period, what happens is that there's a whole period of transition. The most intense period of the Shiva, when one has all of the laws of not leaving the home and wearing the torn garments and not bathing and all of those rituals totally to be focused in the intensity of the mourning period, begin to loosen or emerge slowly in a progression. They go from the 7-day period to the 30-day period, what's called the shloshim, where it becomes a little bit less intense. People could start going out, but they're not supposed to go to live concerts. They're not supposed to, they still continue to say all the morning rituals and to say the Kaddish prayer, but they don't have the same restrictions as during the Shiva period. And they could first begin to go out into the world. And then for a parent, actually, the period continues for an entire 12-month period. 11 months of saying the morning Kaddish, but 12 months of the Yud Bet Chodesh, it's called, where a little bit more we emerge back into the world, but slowly as well. So it's actually an interesting process, a process of allowing us to slow down life a little bit, to not just go right back. You know, a lot of people say the most helpful thing is to go back to your regular routine, and there is truth to that. But in the Jewish tradition, we say we need process, we need grief, we need time to heal, but we also, there's a time to mourn, and then there's a time to get up from mourning. Excessive mourning is not supposed to be done either. So we start with the intensity of the 7 days, really cocooned in one's home, and really, but again, with the community coming to help bring people forward and to help bring them out of their mourning, until slowly but surely over the course of time that mourning diminishes. It's always going to be a hole and always a void, but that people begin to emerge from that mourning period. There's one last thing I want to say, and there's so much more to say on this topic, as you know, Chloe. The one other thing I just wanted to mention is that one of the very interesting things that I do like to share is that the morning ritual, the morning prayer, the Kaddish, the famous Kaddish prayer that is said to honor the departed, it's very interesting. That prayer needs a quorum, needs a minyan. One cannot say that prayer alone. There are other prayers you could say alone, but that needs a quorum, that needs a minyan, because the truth is, in the Jewish tradition, you can't mourn alone. People, when they mourn, sometimes want to completely retreat. And we allow for that in a sense of that we go inward and we're in our home during that period. But the Jewish tradition also says so important is the community during this time, and family and friends and the entire community praying together and coming into the mourner's space, but also affirming during that prayer, saying the Amen, the affirmation of that prayer, because you can't say the Kaddish without community. Again, so much more I'd love to say, and we'll get more into, but I know our honored panelists have so much more to add as well. So I want to give them I want to turn it over to them too.
Thanks so much, Rabbi Mintz. Dr. King.
Thank you. I am really so glad to be here. No matter how serious and somewhat solemn the subject, this is absolutely great. And I'm one to believe nothing just happens, that I accidentally sent you my professional bio, and I'm glad I did, because it was all about health and less about my being the pastor of Liberty Grace Church of God. Mental health is much to do with our celebration of life at the time of death. The purpose of our celebration in the African American community across religions, to a great extent, has to do, no matter what denomination, whether Methodist or Baptist or whatever it may be, is to keep that spirit alive, that the body transitions, but the spirit stays with us. So I would offer you 4 words that encompass our rituals, if you will, and play into the relationships that we have with each other, that really foster our experience at the time of loss. The first is, and this goes back to really, really ancestral wording for us, coming when we were not called African Americans, but Negroes. It's called the setting up. The setting up. The setting up is the way we say it. And the setting up is when a person first dies. The community encompasses the home of that family. And for late nights, we sit up and give stories and just talk about the person when they live. Because the whole purpose in our mind is to cement them, to not let them go. For in fact, in our minds, based on our sojourn, where they're going may be much better than where they've been. Second is the wake. The wake is when the body is viewed, but we say wake because we believe that one day that person will wake up again. Because our whole belief is in Jesus Christ and his burial and resurrection. So wake, our anchor is that we will wake up again. Third, it's a very strange word when people come from the outside in and watch the joy in our services at death. It's called the home going. Because what we really believe is that we're not just mourning the person, but joy and anguish is all mixed up in there like a gumbo. That we have anguish because the person is gone from our physical presence, but they to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. So we strangely celebrate the death of a saint. Then there's the last mile of the way. And in our tradition, often, for me, that separates when you have a real saint. That pastor does not just in the ceremony commit the body, but he or she goes with that family to the gravesite. The last mile of often earthly suffering, joys, and pain. And we go the last mile of the way, but knowing that in the last mile, we will see them again. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. King. Imam Yassin.
I want to start by saying good evening to everybody, and very grateful to be sharing this panel with such esteemed individuals, and it's a pleasure to be learning from them, and also grateful for the opportunity to share my faith tradition and also experiences of my community at the time of death. Many of the things that Rabbi mentioned resonates with the Islamic tradition and the Muslim faith, in that, of course, you know, when a person passes, there is an attempt or a desire to bury the person as soon as possible, to not restrict them or stop them from their eternal abode and their home, the place that God has destined for them. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said that when a person passes, bury them as soon as possible. But if they're a good person, then we want to send them off to their good home and their good abode quickly. And if they're not, then we want to take them off our backs and that burden from our backs very quickly as well. So there is an encouragement in the Islamic tradition to bury the person as soon as possible. Now, before the death occurs, there is also a practice of people gathering around the deceased person and reciting portions of the Quran, and to bring ease for the person and to remind them of God at that time, which is a very difficult moment and a difficult time for them. And then after a person passes, some of the rituals involve shutting their eyes and putting a cloth around the head, beneath the jaw, beneath the chin, to ensure the mouth is closed, and to also tie the toes together so that a person, their legs don't become solidified in a certain position, and to keep their arms by their side. So these are some of the practices that are carried out when the person is passing. Then, of course, arrangements are made instantly to bury the individual, of course, abiding by the laws of the land. And in some Muslim societies, it's easier to bury the person as soon as possible. But of course, living in the United States and previously living in England, you have to obtain a burial order, and that depends on the death certificate being issued. But usually it's done in a very timely manner to accommodate the faith practices of the Muslims, and also I know of the Jewish community that has a very similar practice. And once the paperwork has been received, then we arrange for the wash, the ritual wash. Family usually gather around to wash the individual, and it brings them a lot of closure. And I have a story to share about that in the question and answer time, which was a very touching moment for me in the past couple of years. After the wash, there's a shroud, and the person is then, there's a scent that is poured on the shroud. In the Islamic tradition, masses of people are encouraged to attend the burial, to attend the funeral prayer. So there isn't an invitation that is given out to people. Rather, an announcement is made that such and such person's funeral prayer will take place at such and such mosque, and all are encouraged to attend. The funeral prayer is a silent prayer that involves silent recitations of the Quran and sending prayers upon the Prophet Muhammad, and then petitioning with God to forgive the individual, to shower his mercy on the individual, cleanse them, purify them, and admit them into the highest levels of paradise, and to be a good host to them. After the funeral prayer is performed, then the person is carried. There's an encouragement to carry the person, but depending on, of course, the distance of the cemetery, usually they're driven in a hearse, but then from the hearse they're carried by people to the graveside and then lowered into the grave. After the burial process and the burial period, there is a period of mourning, and there are some time limits that Islam encourages or instructs on mourning periods. And there are also types of mournings that Islam prohibits and types of mournings that Islam advocates and allows. And what Islam prohibits is for people to wail, to complain against God, to beat their chests, to rip their clothes, to slap their cheeks, and to incorporate these types of practices. Islam encourages that people mourn with patience, to be resilient, and to persevere. And of course, the time limits are only for people to visit and not for a person to grieve, because grieving is not an automatic thing that a person can switch on and off. And everybody has a very different way of grieving, and people grieve for longer than some people grieve for longer than others. But if the person passing is a relative besides a spouse, then Islam encourages that the mourning period be for 3 days. And then after 3 days, people get back to their normal work and their normal life, because Islam views death as a very natural part of our existence. And it's a transition from this world to the hereafter. And belief in life after death is a foundational belief in Islamic theology and the Islamic tradition. If the death is of a spouse, then Islam encourages or allows for a woman to mourn the death of her husband for 4 months and 10 days. And there are some cultural practices that are instructed or practiced at that time. Now, during the mourning period, people are encouraged to visit the house of the deceased and to extend their sympathies and their condolences, but they're asked not to be overbearing and to be overwhelming, because sometimes people want to grieve in silence as well. But if they are close relatives, of course, they usually stay there for a longer period of time throughout the entire 3 days. Also, to minimize the burden on the family of that are grieving, the bereaved, for them to provide food for them and to attend to their other needs, so that they're not forced to cook and be involved in mundane things or day-to-day things while they are trying to grieve. This is very difficult for them, and it's a difficult moment. So these are some of the practices that Islam encourages. In some Muslim cultures, they have a gathering of people that come together to recite portions of the Quran, and the intention is to bring comfort to the soul of the deceased in their grave. And these practices occur immediately after the death, sometimes at 3 days, sometimes at 10 days, sometimes at 40 days. So different cultures have different practices, but these are some of the practices within the Islamic faith tradition.
Thank you. Wow, I'm just so struck by how rich these religious traditions are, and how they offer such a container for a wild ride of grief and mourning. So it's really interesting to hear about what grief traditions look like in general in these faith traditions, and we know that it wasn't a normal year. So next question is just a chance to reflect on how these traditions have been adapted and what you've kind of been seeing in terms of what grief ritual looks like in the COVID era. And I'll pass it to Dr. King first.
So the celebrations of life have been much smaller, of course, distant, of course. Many times we've had service outside. But what we've done is give people, because for us, the celebration of life or death for a saint is a promotion. It's a promotion. And so in many ways, as a pastor, I've had to be convincing to my people that the promotion will come later. Our time restrictions don't exist because of the migration of African Americans. Many times we have to wait from family from the South to come this way, or if death occurs in the South, for Northerners to go that way. So migration of African Americans in this country greatly curtails this time frame issue. Now, what I promised them is that a couple things will happen on the other side of COVID. It still gives them hope that, one, in a way of a memorial, we will have a libation, because what we really believe is that these bodies restrict us, and that the spirits of our ancestors are still around, and that those ancestors, now not restricted by bodies, are aiding us in our work today. So through a libation, an African ritual, we honor the presence of our ancestors. And so that is what we'll do on the other side of COVID, not just to show pictures, but through the movement of water from large cistern to small, from small to large. We will honor the presence of the small cistern that has now been poured into a cistern with other spirits that live to aid us in our spiritual practice. So that's the way that I'm helping my people transition and move and survive, because for many African Americans, death, we have to come at it from a mental health perspective. So to think that you, sir, joined here and had major issues on this side, and death comes and there's no reward, that is devastating. So what we say instead, you've gone from glory, which is in your pain, to glory, which is the presence of God, and been promoted and laid aside these earthly vessels.
Thank you. Imam Yassin, what have you seen in terms of adapting the rituals you talked about?
It's been a very difficult year. As you mentioned earlier in my bio, I've been serving in a Muslim cemetery, and I only just relocated back to the Baltimore area very recently. So I was in the United Kingdom during 2 peaks, and we were burying about 20 people a day. They were not all COVID victims or people dying of COVID, but our burial count just increased. And I was also primarily responsible for children burials, but there were no children COVID deaths. But it was a very tough time, and death. This pandemic hit many people in many different ways, and the most difficult part for my community was the lack of presence, because the hospitals were not allowing family members to be close by. Nobody's allowed to attend the hospital during their loved one's last moments. The hospital would allow them to call in via video call, and they would be watching their loved one pass away over a video call, which was very, very difficult and devastating. Then guidelines weren't very clear at the beginning during March last year. So we ourselves were very, very restrictive in what we were allowing family members to do and what they couldn't do. So we were taking care of all the washes ourselves. And there was a period where we were told not to wash, and then Public Health England said you are allowed to wash. And we ensured that nobody passed or died without a ritual wash. And but family members weren't allowed. And one of the things I wanted to share, and I mentioned in my brief presentation, was I got a call from a young man who I actually knew growing up, and it was very touching and difficult. It was a very difficult conversation for me, because he said to me that, Imam, is there any way I can join in my father's wash? I've been washing him for 18 years. And I want to give him his final wash. And I mean, I'm a human being at the end of the day, and it was very, very difficult for me to hold back tears. And it was just to listen to his pain. And it just made me think about my own father, God bless him and keep him strong. And it made me think about what it's like to be in these people's shoes and the shoes of these, brothers and sisters in faith. And we had restricted numbers on people in the burials, 10 people, 5 people. And then, of course, the UK government allowed 30 people at every burial. And that's very unusual for a Muslim burial, because in a Muslim burial, you usually have 100 people, 200 people, 300 people attending. And it was very, very unusual and very different. Most people were allowing people to join in virtually with their Zoom calls and FaceTime and WhatsApp video and all these different platforms, Facebook Live. And I myself personally had lots of conversations with many family members, giving them comforts, trying to bring them some peace and some hope, and giving them some optimism about the person, their loved one being in a better place now. Considered a martyr, because in Islamic tradition, one who dies in a pandemic is considered a martyr, and martyrs are given paradise without accounts and without any accountability. And also shared with them, I produced myself a few pages of prayers that are to be recited in times of grief, and the concept of anxiety and grief from the Quran, and something that I shared with my members that were attending burials. So this is some of the ways that we tried to help them, and we definitely extended our bereavement support, and we were inundated with people that were struggling with the loss of their loved ones during this time. I think more so it was because they weren't allowed to be present during their final moments and at their wash, and that brought a lot of anxiety for people, not knowing who's taking care of their loved one, what's happening with their loved one. Are they in a mortuary? Are they in a morgue? Are they in a hospital? And then keeping in touch with them. And, we were working around the clock. Mm-hmm. Very difficult period.
Thanks. Rabbi Mintz.
Very similar to the Imam's description. There was grief upon grief. People were already feeling tremendous loss and grief from especially some of those family members that they were disconnected from and unable to connect with because they were in nursing homes or other places where retirement villages that had already been on lockdown. And so, the terrible stories of having to not being there and present during those last days, and having to feel a sense of anguish over that loss, and then the loss of the loved one, and the actual loss of losing them forever. That coupled with not then having that container, the way you described it, there's a container of that which allows for the grief to find comfort, and to find comfort amongst community. And I know I had mentioned earlier the idea that Kaddish could not always be said. Kaddish is a burial prayer and a memorial prayer that's said not only at the funeral, but is said during all the prayer services during the Shiva and the 30-day period, and for a parent for 11 months from the date of passing, and is also said on every single anniversary of the death, the Yortzeit. So there were many. One of the things that a lot of people found most distressing was actually not being in a quorum to be able to say a prayer on behalf of their loved one. Now we and the entire community as a whole really went back to the tradition and looked for other ways to be able to say other prayers for the departed. It wasn't always quite the same as saying that prayer that they all knew and the prayers that they were accustomed, so many are accustomed to, the Kaddish, but there were other prayers. There was something called the Kaddish Yachid, the individual Kaddish. There is also a tradition to recite certain Mishnaitic teachings. The Mishnah is the oral tradition that has, in Hebrew, Mishnah has the same words as neshama, as soul. The mem, shin, nun, hey, if you scramble those letters, has the same letters of soul, of neshama. So what we did is we focused on other forms that were less common and less known per se, to how to memorialize and to ritualize these moments, but people were studying the Mishnah and having daily Mishnah study in the memory of their departed. But it was a very, very difficult time. As the Imam said, the idea of people coming to a burial, it wasn't just difficult for the mourners. What I found that was also difficult for the entire community. So many people wanted to show their respects, their last respects, not only for the departed, but also to their loved ones who they cared so much about, to show that. And one of the ways that people did do that, of course, is by coming to the funeral and to showing those last respects. And it's considered a true honor to the departed to be able to come and to show those respects. And so I found that the community as a whole was also struggling. So it wasn't not only the mourners, but the community members were, even those who didn't lose loved ones, were saying, I feel like what can I do? Already there's a sense of what could I do to help the mourners? And it's hard it really is hard to feel helpless, to not know what can be done. And so during the time of mourning in a traditional time period, a regular time period, people go to the Shiva house and people bring food. And, even food was hard people didn't feel in the beginning that you could bring food to somebody else. Wasn't sure if it was healthy, if it was if it would be, could be passed on surfaces and the health of such. So the entire community, I think, was also struggling with how to give support and be there, to how to be present. Presence is one of the key pieces of mourning, is to be present, to always show up. And if you don't know if you should show up to something, you're not sure, just in general, it's always a good idea to show up in times of happiness, in times of laughter, in times of joy, but also in times of pain and suffering. And people really didn't know how to show up and how to be present. But thankfully, there were moments of solace and comfort over Zoom. I'll tell you, it's interesting. I sometimes wonder how this pandemic would have been even so much more difficult if we didn't have the technology. I could only imagine, I can't even imagine how alone people would feel, how much more so alone. And there were shivas that we had shivas where it was over Zoom completely, but the fact was that people came from throughout the country and people were able to come and show and to pay a shiva visit over Zoom. And that was very comforting for people. It really was a tremendous comfort to be able to have that as well. So we have to be grateful that we've had the technology during this period as well.
Thank you. Yeah, as you all were talking, it just struck me that you're naming the double loss of the time for mourners, that they're grieving someone who has died, and then also grieving the way they would have grieved if not for COVID, and naming really beautifully all the creativity that has come out of kind of finding ways to grieve even so. So thank you for doing that creative work. So I'll ask you to keep it short, this one, if you can. But wondering if there are particular resources in your faith tradition that you find yourself turning towards repeatedly, either for your own resilience and comfort or offering to others. A song, a text, a wisdom teaching, a story, and maybe just choosing one and sharing really briefly on it. Start with Imam Yassin.
Thank you for the question. In my faith tradition, and me in particular, and also, people from my community and congregation, they would usually recite Quran in the times of hardship and resort to prayer, ritual prayer that we perform, because they find a lot of comfort and peace in there. As God said in the Quran, seek God's assistance through patience and prayer. So prayer is the ritual prayer that we perform 5 times a day, but besides that, one can engage in prayer at other times as well. So that brings a lot of comfort and peace. And then reciting the Quran also brings a lot of comfort and peace. This is something that we increase during these times of hardship. There are different passages in the Quran that are to be recited at different times, and they're scattered throughout the Quran. But one of them that stands out at this particular time is in the 2nd chapter, in which God says, give glad tidings to those who are patient. And then he defines those who are resilient and patient by saying, when they're afflicted with any calamity, they say, to God we belong and to God we return. And when people respond in this way, God says that upon them will be his mercy and his blessings, and they will be guided. So this is a very powerful prayer in the Islamic tradition that is recited when people pass away to bring us comfort. It gives us a sense of realization that everything in this world belongs to God and everything will return to God. So the person passing has only gone to their rightful place.
So I would say mine comes from Psalms 23:6. And this has been particularly important during COVID. It says that surely goodness and mercy shall follow me, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. The reason that has been so important is because of the extremely high rate of comparative death among African Americans because of COVID. And it had gotten to a point where there was such paranoia because in my district, 21215 of Baltimore, we had the highest of the high in Baltimore. So African Americans were dying at a higher rate in PG County and in Baltimore, but throughout the state, that one area was Death Valley. And so as my members were dying at such a high rate, they began to think something was behind them. So to replace that paranoia of what's tracking you, I replaced that with, here's what we need to do to protect ourselves. And all of what science said, and reminded them that you're right. There is something after you. It's goodness and mercy. And that is following you every day of your life. And at the end of this journey, there's something even better. You will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. And that has become a mantra within my church. That has become a major piece, despite the deaths that we've had in the congregation and at a higher rate in that community.
Thanks, Dr. King. But Rabbi Vince, please.
Absolutely. So my the verse from from Tanakh or holy writings that I've always found a tremendous amount of comfort and solace and inspiration, actually, but even more so during this time, is one that is maybe paradoxical, maybe ironic, but it's from Ecclesiastes, from Kohelet, and the wisest King Solomon writes, Tov lalechet el beit avel milechet el beit mishteh. It's better to go to a house of mourning than to a house of joy and jubilation, a house of feasting. Vasher hu sof hadam, that's the end of every human being. V'chai yitenu libo, and a living should take it to heart. You know, one of the blessings of COVID, in a sense, is actually so many people, so many of us have started to rethink our priorities and what's really important to us, what brings us meaning, what brings us joy. Why are we here on this earth? What is it that we want to accomplish? You know, so many people have transitioned in all sorts of ways. They've changed jobs or changed relationships, or they've decided to take on certain roles that they never had before. They've really focused on what they want to, where they want to spend their time, the limited time we all have on this earth. You know, there's one thing that there's also a famous line that says that people worry about losing money, but don't worry about losing their time. And the truth is, because, and it continues to say, that you could always make back money, but you can never bring back your time. We have one limited resource in our life, and that is time. Time is the most precious thing in the world. So this statement, which people wonder, who could like to go to, and who could prefer to go? It's not that you like to go, but who would choose? Why would you choose to go to a house of mourning than to go to a wedding, to go to a celebration? The truth of the matter is, there's something about going and confronting our mortality that really challenges us and pushes us to make the most of our lives, to make the most of our limited days. Who knows if it'll be for us, or should all live and be well for many, many years. But it really is important to confront those things. And I think King Solomon, and when he writes this, he brilliantly writes this. COVID has really, I think, again, for COVID, there in this time, so many of us have been forced to grapple and to think about things that we've never thought about before. And when we realize that our time, you know, there's a question in our tradition: why don't we live forever? And one of the answers that is given by the sages is because if we live forever, then people would not take advantage and take responsibility for the time that they have on this earth. And the fact that it's limited ensures that we make sure that we really do take advantage and make sure that our days are meaningful, and that we do what we're supposed to be doing on this earth. So that is the phrase, that's the teaching, the verse that I've been taking and holding with me so often. And while it's not something we wish to do, it's a tremendous mitzvah, tremendous good deed to go, and it really rubs off on all of us to be able to be there for comfort for others, to be there at the house of mourning, but also because it helps really focus us on what's important in our lives.
Thanks. Beautiful teachings. So just a few more minutes, but would love to ask one more question. People are talking these days about an impending grief pandemic that will likely follow COVID. What do you think will be the role of faith communities in promoting healing under such circumstances? Role of faith communities in a grief pandemic, and either of you.
First of all, I'm not so sure about that. I have to tell you, the community that I serve, what we've been through this past year, I gotta tell you, I just don't see this. They are so clamoring to be around each other again. They are just ready to climb the walls so I can open those doors again. And mask, gloved, whatever I would say, they're willing to do it to come back in that building. So, yeah, I don't know about these predictions. I know what the role of the church will be. The role of the church will be to expand itself, because what COVID has done, it has shown us that we are much more powerful than stained glass windows, pews, and a stone building. I have far more people watching me now that I've never met before. I know I don't have 1,000 members. I don't know where these people come from. They're in other parts of the country and they're giving to this church. And I have a responsibility to serve those electronic members as a pastor in the same way I do those that are in front of me every Sunday. What we've done is limit ourselves to that space and that time. And it's people who watch me on Tuesday on YouTube and give their tithes and offering. So I don't know, or do I care about what the predictors say? I know I have a responsibility to continue to give joy and service to those people. And that is the silver lining in this process. It's taught me that church is not a place, it's a people.
You know, as there's I'm married to a psychologist. I'm not, so aside from being a rabbi, I do think about these things, this idea of post-traumatic stress disorder and post-traumatic COVID. I do think this will be a very transformative, and this is something that this whole experience, which we originally imagined might be a couple of weeks, the fact that it's been going on for so long, I think will have a very big impact on our psyches, on our person, and on our entire beings for many, many years to come. So I'm not sure exactly how that will be impacted, but I do think, like Chloe, like you said, there is grief upon grief. There is a lot. There is a and some of that could be undone, but some of that is just gonna really shift our who we are to a certain extent. Not necessarily all for the bad, but it is definitely a grief upon grief. One of the books that really impacted me during my time as a chaplain at the University of Virginia was called "All of Our Loss is All of Our Grief," and it's a book that that focuses on the idea that we usually think about grief only in terms of people dying, but there's all sorts of grief. There's grief from loss of a job. There's grief from loss of a relationship. And there's grief, like we've been describing, from the inability to grieve properly, the inability to be able to do that which we're traditionally accustomed to. I think Dr. King is 100% correct that we've seen that communities of faith have so much relevance to people's lives in terms of thinking about the important things. What is meaningful to us? What is important to us and to our lives? And it's not about a building, and to see the community come together. Our community has been praying outside in the midst of 20-degree weather and throughout the entire winter months. In a sense, people don't even want to go back inside 100% because there was something so incredibly inspiring about the fact that we were together and we pulled together through this. And that also will stay with us, that tenacity and that resilience. And that's going to be the key, I think. It's not what happens to us, but how we react to it that really impacts us and over the long term and represents whether we're going to come out more whole or more broken. The truth is, there's nothing more whole than a broken heart, and there's brokenness that we'll carry with us. But our resilience during this time, which I think I do think our faith communities really have an important role in that, a very important role in that. There's a yearning and there's a thirst. As the prophet says, there's a time that there won't be a yearning for food or for water, but rather lishmoa devar Hashem, to hear the word of God and to hear the community together. And there's definitely a thirst now. And there's definitely a thirst for this fellowship and this community, this sense of also that which is eternal in our lives and that which is important and relevant in everything that we do. So, there was a lot of work ahead. And there's a lot of us, all of us, who are yearning and searching for that fellowship and that community. So I hope that, and I know that faith communities will certainly play a role, as will so many other forms of mental health professionals and all sorts of other forms of caregivers during and post this time.
Thanks so much. Thank you, Dr. King and Rabbi Mintz and Imam Yassin, who had to jump off, for your teaching and sharing. So rich. And also just want to extend our deepest thanks to those who contributed interviews to In the Absence of the Proper Mourning, the exhibit that kicked much of this off. This wonderful conversation was inspired by their generous contributions. So thanks so much to those folks. And you can listen to their interviews online at jewishmuseummd.org. So I'll pass it off to Trillian.
Thank you so much, Chloe. Thank you. And thank you just everyone for participating and for sharing and your openness. And I think I really think when we were planning this program this evening, I think we really hoped that it might help us in the work forwards and help us in supporting one another going forwards. And I really feel like I have got so much from this conversation, and I really hope those in the audience feel the same way. I really, yeah, this was just amazing. So thank you. So very quickly, as we always do, we're going to drop some links into the chat already. We have the link to the exhibit In the Absence of a Proper Mourning, where you can go and listen to those interviews more fully. I'll also remind you that there is currently an installation on display in the front of the museum. You can very, very safely visit the experience and listen to the audio on the exterior of the building on display until May 18th, no, 18th. So I encourage you to visit if you possibly can. The other links we're going to drop in chat now. We hosted an opening for the exhibit a couple weeks ago. So we're going to drop that in there now. You'll hear a little more from Tal, along with our director, Sol Davis, and Ronit, who Tala also mentioned in the intro. We'd also like to highlight some of the organizations that our panelists came from this evening. So you can learn more about the COVID Grief Network, the Chloe founded, B'nai Israel, Rabbi Mintz's congregation, and Liberty Grace Church of God, Dr. King's congregation. Thank you. And finally, we're also going to drop a link to LABA, the organization that really spearheaded this series of installations, from which ours is also a part. So just as a final reminder, as everybody leaves this evening, you'll be directed to a survey. Please do take a moment to fill that in and share with us your thoughts about this evening. And just one final last time, I would like to say thank you so, so much to Chloe, Dr. King, Rabbi Mintz, and Imam Yassin. Thank you so much for joining us. And I very much hope that maybe when the world has settled again, we can have a chance to meet in person. So thank you. And thank you everyone for joining us this evening. Thank you.